Hello everyone and welcome to this Stencil JS Crash Course. In this series we will explore Stencil, a powerful and flexible tool for building modern web applications and also reusable and scalable component library. Now the goal for this tutorial is to show you how you can build a reusable component library which is a framework agnostic, future-proof, performant, and you could be able to use this library with Angular, Vue or React. Basically, Stencil is a compiler that takes your code and compile that down to web components. Before we start our crash course, I would to mention if you are looking to elevate your online presence and boost your business, our top tier web development services are the solution you've been searching for. Our highly skilled team of web developers specializes in creating stunning, responsive, and user-friendly websites and applications tailored to your unique needs. We leverage cutting-edge technologies like Stencil JS, Angular, React, and more to deliver unparalleled performance and seamless user experiences. With a proven track record of exceeding client expectations, our end-to-end services cater to businesses of all sizes, from ambitious startups to established enterprises. Choose us for your web development needs and let us bring your vision to life with exceptional quality. Please contact me at my email given in the description of this video. Let's start by creating a new project with Stencil JS. So I would like to teach from the official documentation. You can actually go to the doc and then go to Getting Started Guide, and here you got an option to use npm, yarn or pnp. I'll be using npm and I'll just copy this command and I'll just put that into my terminal and let's press enter. Now it's going to ask you if you want to install this package. So the CLI is called create-stencil. I'm going to press Y and enter. It's going to install the CLI and it's going to ask me what do I want to create. So I would like to create a component library, but you can also use the minimal starter for building a Stencil website. Component lib, confirm, and now it's got this you can choose any IDE to work with Stencil. Could be VS Code or Atom or any text editor will work for it. But I'll be going to using this WebStorm, which is much more powerful IDE. And it's got lots of features that I really like. So that's why I'll be using this. I'm actually going to switch to the doc theme to make the life easier for everybody. Let's take a look at scripts that we get with this project. We'll take a look at package.json, and in package.json you can see we got some scripts build to build the project, start to run the development server, to test the project, and test.watch to run the test in the runtime. Generate is going to be very useful to generate new components. Let's try to run the project. I'm going to open terminal and I'll type npm run start, or you could go with npm start itself as well. Once that is done, then it's saying that it is running this development server. So we'll just open that in Chrome and you can see now we got this hello, I'm Stencil, don't call me JS framework. Let's take a look at folder structure for a Stencil project. We got this stencil.config.ts file. This is going to be our configuration file for all the Stencil configuration. Common ts config file here as well. You got readme file and then the license, and then the prettier is already configured for you. Git ignore to ignore some folders. So in terms of this project, we also have this .idea that is ignored automatically in a Stencil folder. We got this edited configuration. You can modify that if you like. WebStorm follow this file, but if you're using VS Code, we might need some extension to enable this configuration. Next, we got this source folder. This is going to be our folder for all the source code. First, let's take a look at this components folder as we created our fresh Stencil project. And we choose an option to build a reusable component library. That's why we have this my component. We also got some utilities here. You can have this component.default. This will be automatically updated when you create a new component, so you won't have to worry about this much. Index.html is just like an entry point to test your component. Index.ts file, all it's doing is just exporting all the components from this folder. Now right now, if we look at our component, which is a my component, I'll take you to this my component.ts file. This is the boilerplate that we got from the project creation. Here we got some decorators like props. We got this class for component and then the component decorator on top. We'll go through this in details, but for now, we can work with this file structure to make changes. Let's try changing this message within this my component. I'm going to go to index.html file, and here we are using my component, and then the prop first takes this stencil and the prop last take this message. So I'll just go ahead and then remove this for now. I'll just type a gibberish and you'll see our development server will kick in and update the code. How cool is that? In this section of the course, we'll dive deep into the world of stencil components, learning about their structure, how to create custom components, and how to leverage the power of the shadow DOM for encapsulation. Let's get started. Anatomy of a stencil component. A stencil component is made up of three main parts. The HTML template. This is where you define the structure and layout of your component. The CSS. This is where you style your component. The TypeScript code. This is where you define your component's logic, properties, and methods. A typical stencil component consists of a single TSX file that includes both the HTML template and TypeScript code, and a separate CSS file for styling using the component decorator. In Stencil, components are defined as classes decorated with the component decorator. This decorator provides metadata about the component, such as the tag name, style URL, and whether the component should use the shadow DOM. Let's create a new custom component. We'll build a simple user card component that displays a username and an email. We can leverage the CLI. Let's take you to the package.json, and here's a generate command. I'll open a terminal and I'll run npm run generate. This will ask me the name of the component, and we'll just say user card, and then we select all three options, like you want to create a style file, a spec file, or end-to-end test file. By default they're all checked, so I press enter, and it's going to create a new folder for me within the components folder named user card. Let's open user card.tsx file. In this file, you can see we got a component decorator, a class file, user card, and a render function which renders the HTML. Now let's modify this component and add a couple of props there. So we'll use this add prop decorator, and I will use a value name, and type would be just string. Let's add some styling in CSS file. I will just paste the code here, and then in our TS file, we can use this as a class. So I go to TS file, and then in this div, we can simply go ahead and then say class and equal to user card. Now let's run this application. I'll go to terminal and I'll type npm start. Once I do that, it's going to ask me to open that in a browser. I'll use Chrome. You'll see our component is compiled but not showing. So what's wrong here? So basically, I've got to go and add this into index.html file. Here you'll see we got this one component being used, but not the user card. So I will make a line here, and I'll say user card, and then the props we can pass in. For example, it's going to take a name, and we can say hello, and now you can see that card is just going to be reusable. We can also pass in an email, and say email@email.com. And there you go. Now you can see that our card is looking good and it's being rendered on that. The good thing is now you can see you can use this component in Angular, React, or Vue once we compile those, and we'll take a look at those at the very end of this video. By setting the shadow property to true in our component decorator, we enable the use of the shadow DOM for our component. The shadow DOM provides encapsulation for our component styles, preventing them from affecting other parts of the page. Now we'll cover how to work with properties and state in your stencil components using the @prop and @state decorators. We'll also discuss the differences between props and state and when to use each. Let's dive in. Working with props using the @prop decorator. Props are used to pass data down from parent components to child components. In Stencil JS, you can define props using the @prop decorator. Props are read-only, meaning they should not be modified within the child component. Here's an example of how to define and use props in a stencil component. In this example, we've created a simple user card component that accepts a name prop. The parent component can pass the name value like this. Let's talk about managing component state with that state decorator. State refers to the internal data of a component that can change over time. Stencil components can manage their state using that state decorator. When a component's state changes, Stencil automatically re-renders the component. Here's an example of how to manage state in a stencil component. In this example, we've created a simple counter state named counter that maintains its count state using that state decorator. When the user clicks the increment button, the count value increases. And let's test out our increment function, which will take the current value, which is 0, and then will increment once the user is clicking the button. So if I click on this button, let me try refreshing. And if you look at, if I click on increment, it's going to increment. So basically this component is now holding on to this state as well. Understanding the difference between props and state. It's important to understand the differences between props and state in stencil components. Props are read-only data passed down from parent components. They should not be modified within the child component. State is internal data that belongs to the component and can change over time. State updates trigger a re-render of the component. Use props when you need to pass data down from a parent component, and use state when you need to manage data that can change within a component. By understanding and utilizing props and state correctly, you can create more maintainable and efficient stencil components. Before we wrap up with props and state, I would like to take you to the official documentation that you can take a look at and learn more about props and state. So if you go to docs and then go to API, you'll see you got a prop and a state. So click on a prop, it'll give you information about the prop. For example, I didn't use the term variable casting. It's a way to read the value of the prop within your render function, basically in HTML. So it will basically give you more information. State is again the same thing. You can go through this documentation and see what options or what features they have explained here. And it's going to help you a lot to, look at the official documentation, because that's going to be your source of truth. Now we'll explore Stencil JS component lifecycle methods and events. We'll cover the key lifecycle methods, how to handle DOM events using the @listen decorator, and how to emit custom events with the @event decorator. Let's jump in. Component lifecycle methods. Stencil JS components have several lifecycle methods that get called at different stages of the component's life. Some of the most important lifecycle methods are: component will load. This method is called once before the component is rendered for the first time. It's a good place to fetch data or perform other one-time setup tasks. Component did load. This method is called once after the component has rendered for the first time. You can use this method to perform any setup that requires the DOM to be rendered. Component will update. This method is called whenever the component's state or props change, but before the component re-renders. Component did update. This method is called after the component has updated and re-rendered. Use this method for any tasks that need to be performed after the component has updated. Component will unload. This method is called just before the component is removed from the DOM. Use this method to perform any necessary cleanup tasks. Before we take a look at lifecycle hooks examples, let me talk about this event and a listen decorator. A listen decorator is very useful when you want to listen for DOM events. So we'll just click on that and I'll follow some examples from this documentation. So you use this @listen and pass in the event that you want to listen to. You can also listen events from emitted from this event decorator as well, but we'll start with the very simple one. I'll go ahead and then use this command. So let's go here and I'll say npm run generate command, and we will just say my button, enter, and it's going to create a new component for us. Let's open up my component, not my component, but the button component. And here we will first of all use a listen decorator. So I'll type listen, and then I want to pass in the event, which is going to be click event. And I can use the handle click function. You can name the function whatever you like, and I'll just do console.log and we'll just say button clicked. All right, and then we can create a button in the random function. So let me get rid of this, and then we will just pass in button and we say click me. Okay, so we can use this now. Let me get rid of this host because we're not using that anymore. Now let's go back to this one, and we're gonna have to restart the server because we generated a new component. So we just do npm start. Once the generation is complete, now we can go to this index.html and I can use the component my button like that. All right, now let's go to component, and here if I refresh, you'll see another button called click me. And if I click on it, you see that it is saying button click. So you can listen for the event that is, a component is triggering on a click me. So that's about the listen. Now you can also create an event from this event decorator. So if I take you to documentation, we'll go back and then we'll just click on this event document. And the way you can create an event is by using this event decorator, pass a name, and then get the event emitter that you have to import from Stencil core. And you can pass in the data type because we are using this, the example says to do, but we'll just use the string. Simple as that. Let's go to VS Code, and I'm going to use the same command, and I'll create a new component. We'll just say my submit button, enter, and we have another components created my submit button. Let's open its TSX file. Let me paste the code instead of typing it out so we just save a lot of time. Now here you can see I'm using this event decorator. I named this is the submit button, and then the type would be event emitter to any. We also got the handle click function there, and then the render function is just having a button on click and call this function. Now we can listen for this event named submit a button. I'll be using this my submit button in my button component. And if you look at, I'm just passing this my submit button to be able to render this submit button. And also I've got this listen decorator, which basically listens for the event name. And if you look at, here's the event name, submit button. And this is what we're listening for. And once that event is emitted, this listen decorator will listen for it and then call this handle submit button function. So if I go ahead and then click on submit, it is giving me an error. We will probably need to save this file first and then restart. And click on submit. It's still saying there is a problem with the emitter, so it's not able to send this value to this emitter. The way you can fix this is by actually binding it to this. Let's save, and then we can try this now. Let's click, and then you can see that submit button, custom object. So this is where it is basically printing out. Let's talk about watch Decorator in Stencil, which is used to watch for changes in a property or state and execute a method when the value changes. This can be useful when you need to perform some action in response to a change in the component's data. To demonstrate the watch use case, I can go to the user card component. Here you see we got a property called counter. Sorry, not property, but the state called counter and a property name. So what I can do here is paste that function and use the property as counter and call a function on it. Now let's refresh the page. And when I click on increment, you will see it is going to print out the old value and a new value. So every time this value is going to change, it is going to run this function. We can also do something like copy that and I paste it, and then you can put that as a name. And then what I can do here is change the handler to name. Okay. And then here we can, on increment, we can change this dot name equal to this dot name plus this dot counter. Okay, so every time now we are going to change the counter, it is going to change the name. So it's going to be quite a bit of a console log. So let's do refresh, and I click on increment. You will see the old value and the new value was printed, and then it's got the prop name user card is immutable, but was modified from within the component. So prop is immutable, right? It's not, it's, if you want to change the value of something, then you got to use the state instead of a prop, but it did modify but throw the warning. So now it says that hello and hello one, that was the value that's printed. So now we can see, we can watch for the property and we can watch for the state change and then call a function on it. Now we'll explore the add-element decorator in Stencil JS. We'll cover what the add-element decorator is, when to use it, and show you an example of how to use it in your stencil components. Let's get started. What is the add-element decorator? The add-element decorator is a feature provided by Stencil JS that allows you to get a reference to the host element of a component. In other words, it gives you access to the DOM element that represents your component, which can be useful when you need to interact with the component's element or its properties directly. When to use the add-element decorator? You might use the add-element decorator when you need to access DOM properties or methods of the host element that are not exposed through props or state. You want to integrate with third-party libraries that require a reference to a DOM element. You need to perform manual DOM manipulation that can't be achieved through Stencil's JSX rendering. Let's look at an example of using the add-element decorator in a stencil component. Let's start by creating a new component. I'll name it my focusable input. We have the new component. We go to index.html, and I'm actually going to comment out some of these components, and then I will bring in my focusable input, and we will take a look at, after refreshing the page, we actually need to restart the server. So type npm start and restart it. Once this is restarted, then we refresh, and we should have this my focusable component that is now being rendered. So the page should just be empty because basically there's nothing here. So if I type it in h1 or h2, let's say, I'll type gibberish and you'll see it's going to get printed. So the component is being rendered, but it's not really showing anything. Now, to save time, I would like to just copy paste the code and explain. So let me just paste the code. Now we need to import element, so add a missing import there. Let's go on the top, tap comma, and get element. And we're gonna have to remove this new keyword there. In this example, we have a my focusable input component with an input field and a button. We want the input field to gain focus when the button is clicked. To achieve this, we use the addElement decorator to get a reference to the host element. Inside the focus method, we use the host element reference to access the shadow root and query for the input element. Then we call the focus method on the input element to set the focus. By using the addElement decorator, we can interact directly with the host element of our component and perform DOM manipulations as needed. In this section, we'll be covering the method decorator. We'll discuss what it is, when you should use it, and provide an example of how to implement it in your stencil components. Let's get started. What is the method decorator? The method decorator in Stencil JS is used to expose public methods in your components. These methods can then be called by other components or JavaScript code outside of your component. This can be useful when you need to perform an action or retrieve information from a component that cannot be achieved using only props and events. Let's talk about when to use the method decorator. You might use the method decorator when you want to expose a public API for your component that can be called by parent components or other JavaScript code. You need to perform actions or retrieve information from a component that cannot be achieved using only props and events. Let's look at an example of using the method decorator in a stencil component. I'm going to go to index.html file and comment this out, and we bring our user card back, which has a counter. I think user card is a pretty good component to, demonstrate this. For example, what are the counter that you currently have? You would like to access this outside. We can start by using @method, and then we pass in async function, get count, and all we gotta do is just return this dot counter. Okay, so now this is a publicly exposed method. You gotta make sure that you use the async methods. So all the public methods must be in async. You can use, for example, here async await. You can use this promise.resolve. You can also use this if it doesn't return anything. Okay, this is not gonna work because it's not an async method. Let's go back to our application. I'm gonna just do a refresh. And once I do the refresh, now we have a publicly exposed method. Now, how do we use this? Let me go ahead and then uncomment my custom input. For example, let's go to which button we can do. Let's just say my button. Let's go to index.html and we're just gonna uncomment this my button, which is gonna give me these two. And within this, we can just get rid of this for now. And then all we gotta do is just click it and then show the current counter of it. And the way we can do that is by creating a new function here. I'll just paste that. It says async retrieve count. So all it's doing is just document query the my counter, and the my counter has to match your component name, which in this case is not my counter, it is a user card. So user card, and then once you do that, the error will go away for a get count. We still have an error, which is this function keyword. We gotta get rid of that. We can't use the function keyword when we're defining functions for this class. So now we need to call this function. So we just say on click, and I'm gonna just call this dot retrieve count. All right, so now let's go to increment, just increment to, let's say, whatever the value you want to increment. And if you click on click me, now the value, current count value is 10. Now you can see you can access the public method on this instance of this document query selector. We talked about lifecycle hooks, but I haven't really shown you the code. How do you invoke these hooks? So first of all, let me go to index.html. I'm just gonna comment out user card. We go to button and I'm gonna just paste the code here. So basically these are the raw functions that you're creating, and these will be triggered because Stencil already know that you're creating a component. Now if I take you to the code and I'll just refresh, you'll see it says component will load and component did load. So now if we look at the code, that's what it's printing. So component hasn't been unloaded yet, or it hasn't updated. So that's why we don't have those hooks being triggered. So basically to invoke a hook, you just call a function and then you do whatever you want to do within the function. It's time for us to take a look at some official documentation. So basically, if you go to the guide, you will see after lifecycle hooks, there are some concepts that they will be explaining, but I'd like to cover this section. So we look at this page. This is basically just an overview of your APIs available in Stencil. Lifecycle methods, this is where it explains what happens to the component within this lifecycle. So you're more than welcome to take a look at this diagram. It's pretty self-explanatory and will tell you what exactly happens every time component is created. Now all of these like connected callback or disconnected callback, a component reload. These are all lifecycle hooks, and we already talked about those. So if you want to read the official documentation, I think you should. You'll have a lot more information than I could explain in the overview of the section. So this is where it talks about all the lifecycle hooks. Now, component decorator, if we look at our VS Code, we have this component decorator, right? This is what gives a metadata to a stencil to say this class, this types of class will be treated as a component. Right now, we only have this tag, which is like the name of your component, a style URL, or a shadow DOM to be true or false. You can find the API here, that what's available for this component decorator to take. We know about the tag. It's like a name for your component. If you look at this assert dir, there's another API, which basically is the array of related paths from the component to directly containing the static file. So if you want to have a static file imported in your component, for example, here's the image that it's showing, you need to specify that path here in the assets directory. So you could be able to use the path right here, which is very, very cool. Now we also have this scoped, and these are all optionals. Okay, you're more than welcome to read about what is the scope. So basically scopes, this is an alternative to using a native shadow DOM style explanation, encapsulation. Now I'm gonna go to the differences. We already use this style URL. If you look at React, we're using this style URL, which is like one CSS file, but you can have a multiple CSS file for your style of the component. As you can see here, if you make that style URLs, and you can pass in an array. Styles, you can do an embedded style for a component. It's just like, you can pass in this color red. I won't go over this, but you can read about what exactly the JSX do for embedding or nesting styles for nesting components. Let's go to events. We talked about event decorator. We took an example as well. And, this is very fine. Most of the information that I explained to you. But you also have some information like using events in JSX or listening to event from a non-JSX element. So it's always good to take a look at the crash course, but also go with the official documentation. Functional components are a bit of a topic that just recently came in Stencil version 3.2. This is the same as, React, going from class-based component to function-based component. Here you'll find all the information related to functional. This is very important to read. I'll go through it quickly. So basically the function components are not going to be compiled down to web components. They don't create a DOM node, and they don't have a shadow DOM or scoped styles. They don't have a lifecycle hooks, and they are stateless. So when you use functional components, here they clearly says if you want to use a functional component, you make sure that the component must not have any state or props or any, methods that you need. So if this is just a markup, you can use a functional component. Next, we go to host element. So the host element is a functional component that can be at the root of the render function to set attributes and events to the host element itself. So here's an example. We already talked about host element and also taken an example. I want to mention that the host can be used as a fragment. Remember, if you're coming from a React, you have this empty. Let me take you look at. Let me go over here. So if you look at this, go down and then add a line, and then you see this is like a fragment in React. It's like containing a multiple elements within one. You can use this fragment, and this is also supported in Stencil. But the better way of defining that fragment is like host element, okay, in Stencil. Now, if we look at the styling section, we'll do that later, but we already gone through the shadow DOM, which is like, somewhat behaves as styling host element when using a shadow DOM and does not quite the same. So it's like a encapsulated, styling for your particular element. We talked about methods. I don't want to go through this because we already seen what are the methods and public and private method for a component. Properties. That was the first thing that we talked about. Prop, which is like setting up a property which can take the value from the host component. We also have this reactive data using the watch decorator. So anytime the proper state changes, prop is a mutable, which means it will not change, but we can apply the watch on a prop. But the state is something that will be changed. So you can basically watch for a state change and do some operation within a component. Internal state, with the state we already talked about. If you want to have a placeholder where you can hold a state, you can use the state, and then you can basically use the listen to handle the event on the state as well. Next, we have a styling. We will have a separate video talking about styling components and a shadow DOM. But let's go over JSX. JSX, you should be familiar with JSX if you have a React JS background. It's the same syntax that will be used in Stencil as well. Now, similarly, you have this data binding, like a single curly brackets to read the prop. You can also do a conditional using if and else within your render function. You can also use this ternary operator like that. If you go down, you can also pass in expressions when using a component from the parent. You can also do conditions like that as well. Now, slot is something that I want to talk about. So components often need to render dynamic childrens in specific location. For example, from the button, you want to pass in the label, and you have a multiple types of label, but you don't know where to put that in a button. So what you can do is you can create a slot element and then push it in as a button value. Then you can pass in, a new, label or paragraph or text or H1 or H2, whatever from the outside. And the stencil will basically take that and then render it here. Next, we have dealing with children's. Look, I don't want to go through and spend time explaining these things. These are very common in React.js. So if you have a React background, or if you don't have a React background, you should find an online documentation. So documentation for JSX. And if you go with like introducing JSX in the React, that's pretty much the same as you will do with the stencil as well. So go ahead and learn JSX. There are a lot of concepts right here as well, but you can also learn JSX, out of stencils, because JSX doesn't really, the specific thing to Stencil JS. This is a crash course, so we cannot go everything available in Stencil. I've gone through the component and its APIs and given you an examples and explanation how to use those. There are other guides available in the documentation. For example, if you want to create an Angular-based stencil component library, you can follow this guide. It's pretty straightforward if you know Angular, because if you know Angular, you should be able to follow this very easily. Now, we have other frameworks integration like React or Vue as well. You can take a look at that as well. But I'll do a separate video for integrating Stencil component library with Angular, JavaScript, and React. But the takeaway from this is to take a look at this components API, create some components, build them, and then publish them to your npm package. And once they're published, you should be able to use them in Angular, React, or Vue, or anywhere. Now, before we wrap up this course, I would like to give you a quick guide to be able to publish this. So if you go to guides, here's a publishing guide in the documentation, and this is automatically configured for you if you create a new fresh project using create stencil. Here's a guide that you need to follow. This is the configuration. So if you look at the package.json, you have all the configuration automatically done for you, right? You don't have to worry about most of the things. Now, if you want to know what these configurations about, you can read them. They are pretty common in Node.js world. Okay, so here's a guide to publish. Now, to be able to publish the component, you will need to follow this contributing packages to registry. Here they talk about how you can upload to npm.js. The takeaway is npm.js will allow you to create an account. You create an account with npm. You sign into that account through command line. So if I go to React and I'll go new terminal, I'll say npm login. Here it's going to ask me enter the open the browser, or you can basically sign in like that. Once you do that, there is a npm publish command that will automatically take this folder and publish that package according to your package.json file. Moving back to Stencil, here you'll find pretty much everything that you need for a Stencil. I will create a separate videos for framework integration and a shadow DOM with Stencil. You can also do a static site generation, which it's out of the scope of this video. Okay, so last thing before we wrap up this video is going to be about configuration. So the configuration file, you already know that it automatically created for you. What configuration you can do within this file is listed here. Okay, so take a look at this guide. You will find everything that you need to configure Stencil. You got the dev server guide, CLI guide, when you create a new component or you want to create a new application. You got some extras, take a look at those if you really like, and then you have the Stencil plugins. So by default, Stencil does not come with Sass or post Sass. You can add Sass with installing a Sass plugin within Stencil. And basically, once you do that, you add this configuration here. So resolve plugin, node polyfills, right? And here's a plugin that you can use to add Sass to your Stencil component library. All you gotta do is just install it and then follow this configuration. So in the plugins, just type Sass and you have a Sass available for you to use. Let's go back to the Stencil. Next, we're going to talk about the output targets. So output target is some sort of configuration that allows you to, configure the compiled version of your component library, like here in dist. So let me zoom in maybe a bit. Let's see, I can zoom into it. So this folder is getting generated from this configuration. You can specify the tops and then docs as well. So yeah, take a look at this configuration that you want to do. You should be able to follow this. Okay, so that's pretty much it for a crash course. I would highly recommend to go through this documentation if you want to learn more about Stencil. This is a great compiler to build cross-platform components that can be used in different frameworks like Angular, React, or Vue.js. Hope you liked the video. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and I'll speak to you guys in the next one. Cheers, thank you.